Chapter 11. Mr. Leper watched from the shadows as Jordan Scott stood a few feet away, taking a leak. The boy was staring right at him now. The old man had stumbled slightly, possibly giving away his location in the woods. After a moment, however, Jordan looked away. Then he started walking toward his house. How many kids were out here? Leper had seen 4 leaving the Scott house with camping equipment earlier. What were they up to? Didn't they know how dangerous these woods were? Did their parents know about this? Leper doubted it, just as much as he doubted that anyone knew that he was in fact the Texas Devil. The nosy old man stepped out of his hidden spot and headed in the direction Jordan had come from. Soon he came across 2 tents in a small open area. One tent was quiet and small. The other had some activity going on inside. These kids wouldn't know what hit them. He couldn't wait to beat their brains in with a rock, cut off their genitals, and throw the bodies in a hole. He would keep the genitals. The quiet tent was closest, and the flaps were slightly open, but he passed it by in favor of the one with the activity. He started toward it, his hands and loins itching for the girl, and maybe even the boy he'd seen venturing into the woods earlier. He had a feeling they were the ones who occupied this tent. Before Leper could get to the noisy tent, he was seized at the back of the neck and dragged away. The grip was so tight he thought his neck would snap at any moment. He couldn't even yell as he watched the campsite grow farther away. He couldn't see what had him, but he felt like he was in the jaws of a wild animal. No, it couldn't be. He was the Texas Devil, the crazy murderer who stashed his victims in these woods. What had seized him now couldn't be. Leper tried to look at his assailant, but the grip on his neck prevented that. He reached back, expecting to feel a muzzle, a jaw, but found what felt like a hand. A cold, clammy hand. Was this thing like Bigfoot or something? Despite all these thoughts going through his head, Leper was more terrified than he'd ever been. He now knew what his own victims must have felt just before they died. Deep down, Leper knew he would not survive this night. The pressure on the back of his neck suddenly vanished. The old man was given the briefest glimpse of his attacker before he found himself plunging headfirst into a hole in the ground, a hole he normally would have dug himself, but he hadn't dug this one. Dirt was thrown in to fill the gaps, preventing Leper from moving an inch. All he could do, while he waited to die from suffocation, was marvel at the possibility of what he'd seen. And as he sat there on his head, the blood rushing to his brain, he laughed at the fact that he'd been buried upside down in a hole. It was his own modus operandi. Before he died, he thanked whatever god that the attacker hadn't ripped his genitals off of him first. Jordan woke to sunlight in his eyes. He was in the den, sitting on the comfy gray couch. Rays of light were filtering through the blinds at an angle, warming his face as he leaned his head back over the cushion. He noticed he had a blanket draped over him. He felt nice and comfortable there, though something nagged at the back of his mind. Then it hit him. He was supposed to be in a tent in the woods behind his house. He threw the blanket off and looked through the blinds. What time was it? He looked at his watch and saw that it was a little after 6 in the morning. Why was he inside? He tried to remember. He'd been really cold last night, so he came back to the house to grab the blanket. He could remember nothing after that. He must have sat down for a moment and fallen asleep. He grinned and shook his head in embarrassment. He had some serious apologizing to do to the others when he returned to camp. When he got there, he found Connor and Travis standing in front of their respective tents. "Where the fuck have you been?" Connor asked his cousin. "I went back to the house to get a blanket and fell asleep on the couch." Connor grinned. "You little bitch. We slept out here in this cold forest while you lived it up at the house." "It was your idea to camp out here and hunt for something that probably doesn't exist." For a moment, Connor said nothing. Then he laughed. "Touché," he said. Jordan looked around the woods. "Where's Aaron?" Connor and Travis looked at each other, both suddenly nervous. Jordan was about to ask what was wrong when a scream pierced the air. The three boys followed the direction of the scream to the little stream they'd found yesterday. There they found Erin, staring at something. She had her hands to her mouth, as if trying to stifle any more screams. Travis ran up and held her as he too found what had frightened her. And then Connor saw it. Finally, Jordan saw the feet sticking out of the ground. Police surrounded the area nearly an hour later. They questioned the kids about why they had been out here in the first place, whether they knew the victim, Mr. Lepper, and if they had seen or heard anything strange last night. Jordan couldn't tell if he and his friends were considered suspects, but he wouldn't be surprised if they had been. Jordan told the police that he had slept at his house. He listened in on the others' interrogations as well. Connor and Travis had slept in their tents. Erin, however, said she'd slept in Travis's car. Jordan couldn't help but find that curious. Erin went on to explain that she and her boyfriend had a fight and that she went to Jordan's house, but no one was home. The cops then returned to Jordan, who told them that he may have been asleep when she showed up. The police didn't like the inconsistencies in what should have been a simple explanation. Jordan thought of telling them that it may have been the Texas Devil, but he held his tongue. He'd already withheld telling them about the figure he'd seen while taking a leak last night. That may have been Mr. Lepper himself, and Jordan didn't think it wise to admit he'd seen the victim shortly before his death. Dad came home later that night, cutting his trip short. When it came to gauging his reaction to the news, Jordan was clueless. Judging by his words alone, Dad clearly wasn't happy about the kids camping in the woods. However, there was no telling tone in his voice to go by. He almost seemed indifferent. He merely lectured the boys about the danger of going into those woods at night. The news of Mr. Lepper's death drew some spark that played across Dad's face. He tried to hide the emotions, but Jordan saw flickers. Horror, revulsion, confusion. It was bizarre to witness. Dad couldn't possibly feel bad about the old man's death, could he? Or maybe it was because of the fact that Mr. Lepper died so close to where Jordan and Connor had been. The thought must have been nauseating. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Jordan had become a celebrity at school. News had spread that he had found his neighbor's body behind his house. His classmates kept asking him if the Texas Devil had killed Mr. Lepper. Jordan didn't hate the attention and didn't want to tell them that he had spent the night in the safety of his own house, so he merely said it was possible. He worried, however, about that nosy reporter Deidre Marshall. He had hoped she would lose interest in his father, but there was no chance of that now. When he got to English class, he found Erin waiting for him by his desk. Her lovely eyebrows were turned upward, and she looked worried. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I'm just really sorry about last weekend." "Why? You didn't do anything, did you?" He grinned. "I can tell you didn't want to go camping," she replied. "I can't help but feel like you only did it for me." Jordan chuckled. "Don't flatter yourself, honey. I did it because it sounded like fun." She laughed, looking relieved. "There's something I want to ask you, though," Jordan said. "You want to know why I spent the night in the car?" she guessed. "Travis and I had a fight, and I just didn't want to be anywhere near his ass." "Oh, I, heard you two making out in your tent." He blushed. "You wouldn't think that would lead to a fight, huh?" "Was he trying to get you to do something you didn't want to do?" Jordan asked. "Sort of." She seemed apprehensive now. "I've never done it." "You mean the sex?" He cocked an eyebrow. Erin burst into laughter. Several classmates glanced at her. Jordan marveled at the beauty of her laugh. He wanted to tell her to dump her rapist boyfriend. He wanted to tell that he would treat her better than Travis ever could. Why couldn't he just tell her these things? What was he afraid of? Jordan saw a few reporters parked in front of Mr. Lepper's house as he walked from the bus stop to his own home. If not for the nature of the death, he doubted it would have been enough on its own to warrant this much media attention. The kids had been left out of any official news stories, but it wouldn't be long before the press found out. After all, it hadn't taken long for the school to find out. Jordan kept his head down as he walked toward his house. He stared intently at the street, his heart suddenly racing the closer he got. He could hear the reporters recording their segments. One voice in particular made him look up. Deirdre Marshall. He gave her a passing glance as he strode by. She was facing him, but looking at her cameraman as she read her script. Her eyes shot to Jordan quickly, though she never faltered in her words. "Mr. Scott," she called a moment later. Jordan had just reached his driveway when she called to him. He stopped and turned around. "Hello again," she said with a smile as she briskly approached him. "Quite an exciting week, isn't it? I heard it through the grapevine that you were the one to discover the body. Is that true?" Jordan wanted to tell her that it wasn't true, but he also didn't want to put Erin on this vulture's dinner plate. "Maybe," he compromised. Her smile vanished, only to be replaced with a sympathetic expression. "That must have been very frightening, discovering the body of your beloved neighbor practically in your backyard." "He wasn't very beloved." The reporter arched an eyebrow. "Really? He had enemies?" Jordan scolded himself for saying that. "The whole neighborhood hated him for a bunch of reasons." "Did your father have a reason?" Jordan didn't want to say any more. He'd already said too much. He wished he'd just kept walking. To remedy that, he turned on his heel and walked to the front door. It may have looked suspicious, but there was nothing else he could do. Deirdre followed. The moment he stepped onto the porch, the reporter said, "You can see why I find this story so interesting, can't you?" She sounded like she was pleading. Before Jordan could touch the doorknob, the door flew open. Standing just inside the house was Dad. His eyes were hard as he stared at Miss Marshall. "Hello, Mr. Scott," she said to him. He didn't respond. "I was just asking your son a few questions about Mr. Lepper," she continued, unfazed. "Such a terrible tragedy." "You don't want to talk to my son," Dad said. "You want to talk to me, and that's just not going to happen. Good day, Miss Marshall." Dad ushered Jordan inside and closed the door in the bewildered woman's face.